Hi there. My name is Mark Lozano. I'm a PhD candidate in the Energy Systems program at the University of California, Davis. And today I'll be presenting my most recent project titled Assessing the Three E's: Environment, Economy, and Equity in CAPS. This project was the PI was Professor Alyssa Kendall. So the first question you might have is, what is a CAP? This stands for Climate Action Plan. CAPs are documents that are developed by local jurisdictions across the globe, and they basically guide the climate action of that jurisdiction. These documents typically set goals for greenhouse gas emissions reduction. They propose the strategies that they plan to implement in order to achieve these goals, which span across multiple sectors. And they also provide a lot of supporting information, such as the expected greenhouse gas emissions reduction potential, the expected cost and sources of funding, the equity impacts of the proposed strategies, any co-benefits, performance indicators, timelines for implementation, et cetera, et cetera. Now, for this project, we focused exclusively on CAPs developed in California, so developed by local jurisdictions in this state. There are two parts to this project. The first is a CAP content analysis. So we wanted to assess the quality and quantity of information that is included in these climate action plans. To do this, we developed a scoring metric to basically quantify a qualitative data. And we collected information from over 30 CAPs here in the state. What we did after scoring the inclusion of 3E data was comparing them to 7 demographic variables using simple linear regression to explore any trends. The second part was developing a survey in order to explore the ways that CAPs are currently being both planned and implemented to really ground this work into what is currently happening in the real world. This survey also had two parts. The first was a more quantitative set of questions where we asked the respondents to quantify or to express the extent to which they considered various factors in both planning and in implementation. And then we also asked additional open-ended questions on equity, funding, reporting, and updating the CAP, and more. So we'll first look over the CAP content analysis. This is an overview of the scoring metric that we used, which you can look at if you pause the video. I'll quickly look over the way that we scored equity. For example, a score of 0 would be a CAP that had no mentions of equity, whereas a score of 3 would be a CAP that had both prominent and specific themes for either most or all of the proposed strategies. Really, a score of 3 means that the CAP had a very robust and very specific amount of information on the equity impacts of their climate action plan. So we went and had these categories for all 3 E's. After doing this, we compared those scores to both the year of CAP publication and a couple of demographic variables, the information of which we pulled from the US Census. And we performed a linear regression to see if there were any significant correlations, which we did find and are highlighted here. Now, instead of just looking at this table, I did go ahead and graph these or visualize these in this figure. What we'll see here are lines between two variables that had a significant correlation, with more lines or thicker lines representing a more significant correlation. What we found here is that all 3 E's, equity, emissions, and cost or economy, had scores that improved steadily over time. We also see that equity is correlated with the education level of the constituents in that jurisdiction. And if we look at emission scores, those were negatively correlated with both poverty rate and the white non-Hispanic population in that jurisdiction, which suggests that both wealthier jurisdictions can afford to have better emissions data, and also that more diverse jurisdictions have higher and more quality emissions data in their CAPs. After doing this, we realized that there could be more work done on the way that we assess CAPs. And so I developed another set of metrics that could be used in future work. So you could score the inclusion of other variables, including co-benefits, community engagement, and mentions of indigenous communities and tribal lands, as seen here. I also thought it would be important to look more in depth at the impacts, not just at the broader cap, but also looking at specific sectors. And so I also developed questions by sector. Now, the takeaways from this research was not only looking at the ways that caps are currently progressing, but also offering suggestions and ways to both assess caps that currently exist, but also help guide the current development or future development of new caps so that they do include more prolific equity information. Now, the second part was the survey. Now, what we did was first ask the respondents a set of Likert scale questions, specifically, how much did you consider the following factors during planning, and then how much did you consider them during implementation? These scores ranged from 1 to 5. And what I did was I actually normalized these scores against the average score per respondent for each phase, either planning or implementation. And this was to highlight the relative consideration of factors. For example, if across 4 questions we had answers that ranged from 3 to 5, we would say, well, these either received like middle or like high levels of consideration. But really my focus here was to see, well, across these 4 factors, did any receive higher than average levels of consideration? And did any really receive below average levels of consideration? And were these differences significant? So we did this for 8 factors, which are listed in the figure here. Those were greenhouse gas emissions reduction, the cost of the strategies, impacts on local pollutions, the stated local priorities of the jurisdiction's constituents, the local impacts of those actions, external impacts of those actions, impacts on disadvantaged communities, and the timeline for implementation. Now, there were a number of findings that I highlighted here on the left, but for example, we see that the expected greenhouse gas emissions reduction was one of the most highly, well, it was the most highly considered factor, both during planning and during implementation. Whereas, for example, external impacts received well below average levels of consideration across both phases. We also found that the impacts on disadvantaged communities, which was our equity-centered variable across these factors, received average levels of consideration across both phases. After looking at these results, we also wanted to compare the levels of consideration between the phases, which I graphed here. And what we see here is if we look at consideration during implementation compared to during planning, costs actually received significantly higher amounts of consideration during implementation. So it was a lot more important to them during that phase, whereas the stated local priorities of the constituents received less consideration during implementation than it did during planning. There were a couple of other takeaways that we got both through the Likert scale questions, but combining those with the open-ended questions. And these were categorized into, for example, these 4 categories. When we look at equity, the respondents mentioned that there has been a very strong community push in recent times to include more equity themes and caps. They also frequently mentioned that equity-centered funding is key to the success of equitable climate actions. If we consider life cycle equity, which looks at the equity implications, not just at the point of implementation, but both before that and after that, which oftentimes has impacts that are beyond the jurisdictional borders, the respondents stated that they have limited control over what occurs at a state, national, and international level, and that it really is beyond their scope to even consider these external impacts. When it came to funding, city funds were the most, well, oftentimes the most frequently cited source of funding, but many jurisdictions also had to look to external grants, to community-generated fees, and even free or volunteer work, both to implement actions and to update their caps. When it came down to implementation, they mentioned that the budget and cost relationship of the proposed actions, as well as political will of the jurisdictions, were the 2 biggest influencers on a project's likelihood of implementation. We will soon be releasing a full report on this work that you can learn more about this project. But in the meantime, if you're interested to learn more, feel free to email myself or the PI, Alyssa Kendall. Thank you so much.